Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and J.D. Vance stood on the stage, but only one of them held the power of the room. The word escaped her lips for a third consecutive time, hanging awkwardly in the chilled, heavily air-conditioned atmosphere of the expansive auditorium. It was in that precise, agonizing fraction of a second that the entire room, composed of seasoned journalists, political strategists, and ordinary citizens, collectively understood a devastating reality that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had not yet managed to process herself. She was tightly gripping a standard plastic pen in her right hand. The sheer physical force of her anxiety had caused the blood to drain entirely from her knuckles, leaving her thumb stark white against the dark barrel of the pen. Her eyes, usually so focused and commanding, darted frantically, searching the empty, sterile air somewhere just above the back rows of the audience for a coherent sentence, a lifeline of rhetoric that simply refused to materialize in her mind. Merely 4 feet away to her left, separated only by a small, polished wooden table holding their water glasses, sat Senator J.D. Vance. He was dressed conservatively in a plain, impeccably tailored dark suit that absorbed the intense glare of the studio lighting. His posture was notably distinct from hers. He sat completely still, his large hands resting evenly and calmly upon his knees. It was the unmistakable, deeply ingrained posture of a man who had spent years in environments far more hostile than a political panel, a man who had profoundly learned the strategic art of waiting. He did not lean forward to offer a polite interjection or a helpful segue. He did not attempt to rescue her from the suffocating pause. Instead, he simply allowed the heavy, crushing silence to perform the devastating work that only silence can do in a room full of expectant observers. When he finally chose to break the tension, he spoke in a tone that was remarkably low, deliberately measured, and almost unnervingly gentle. It projected effortlessly into a hall where hundreds of attendees had collectively stopped breathing. "You called me a clueless man about the world," he stated softly, his eyes locked onto hers with unwavering intensity. "So let me ask you one thing about it." And in that moment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a political phenomenon who had constructed an entire meteoric national career on the premise of never ever running out of words, found herself entirely devoid of them. To fully comprehend how a prominent congresswoman, a woman who practically lived her life illuminated by camera flashes and amplified by microphones, completely lost command of a room to 20 excruciating seconds of her own silence, one must rewind the clock approximately 40 minutes. One must return to a moment earlier in the evening when she still firmly and genuinely believed she was unequivocally the smartest, most capable person sitting on that stage. The event was the highly anticipated Atlantic Security Forum. The organizers had successfully orchestrated a media spectacle, drawing television crews 3 networks deep along the back wall of the Grand Hall. Their cameras were mounted on heavy tripods, the steady, unblinking red recording lights indicating that every major news outlet was rolling. Word had rapidly circulated throughout political circles in Washington, and beyond that, the forum's planners had intentionally, and perhaps mischievously, placed these 2 ideological polar opposites on the exact same panel. Consequently, the auditorium was packed far past its legal seating capacity. The overflow crowd was forced to stand shoulder to shoulder along the side walls, cramming into the spaces where the venue's ushers typically mandated the aisles remain clear for fire safety. Down in the very first row, directly in the line of sight of the panelists, sat a man in his early 30s. He wore casual, practical clothing that stood in stark contrast to the tailored suits surrounding him. He had woken up before dawn and driven the long, monotonous stretch of highway up from Ohio that very morning. When he walked to his seat, he moved with a pronounced permanent hitch in his step, a daily painful reminder stemming from the portion of his left leg that did not make the journey home from a combat deployment in Ramadi, Iraq. Naturally, nobody seated on that elevated stage knew his history yet, and nobody in the room would understand his significance until much later in the evening. He hadn't endured the long drive and the physical discomfort for the sake of petty partisan politics or cable news soundbites. He had simply wanted, just for one night, to occupy the same room with somebody in power who had actually been to the dangerous, unforgiving places he had been. He sat quietly, his calloused hands folded neatly in his lap, and he waited with the exact same disciplined patience he had acquired during his military service. The panel commenced with the moderator delivering her opening remarks warm, practiced, and polished. She skillfully navigated the biographies of the participants. When the floor was officially yielded to Ocasio-Cortez to offer her opening thoughts regarding American leadership on the global stage, she seized the opportunity with her characteristic practiced vigor. She took possession of the microphone the way she always did, like a woman confidently claiming an object that rightfully belonged to her by divine right. I want to be absolutely honest. Before we perform the sanitized, polite version of this panel, she began, her voice ringing out clear and resonant. A thin, sharply defined smile played across her lips. Because I firmly believe that this country deserves honesty far more than it deserves superficial manners. And frankly, I have never been very good at abiding by traditional manners anyway. She did not hesitate to launch her attack. I look across the stage tonight and I see a clueless man who wrote a sad, highly stylized little book about experiencing poverty, managed to get himself admitted to Yale Law School purely on the strength of how sad that narrative was, and subsequently decided that this personal trajectory magically transformed him into a geopolitical expert on a planet he has barely even seen. Her tone grew sharper, her enunciation precise. That is not a legitimate political resume. That is a calculated marketing campaign with a military uniform conveniently stapled to the front cover of it. A complex, layered sound immediately moved through the packed hall. It wasn't quite a gasp of shock, but rather something significantly cooler, a collective inhalation of breath from an audience recognizing a deeply personal and aggressive escalation. She plowed forward, fueled by the energy of the room. And the people who enthusiastically applaud that narrative, the people who derive their entire limited understanding of the complex world from a static-filled pickup truck radio dial somewhere on the rural stretch between a Sunday church service and a local gun store. The people who inherently think an international passport is something that only happens to other wealthier families, they desperately deserve to be told the unvarnished truth, too. She leaned slightly into the microphone, maximizing her volume. The future of this diverse country is absolutely not going to be written by a toxic combination of rural nostalgia and misplaced grievance. I am that future. I embody exactly what it looks like. He is merely a fading memory of the past, dressed up in a suit, sent here tonight by his billionaire backers to tell you that yesterday was somehow better than it actually was. Having delivered her prepared blow, she leaned back in her plush chair, looking immensely satisfied with her performance. She had just publicly and deliberately insulted the exact demographic of citizens who were, at that very moment, leaning toward their television screens in the living rooms of Ohio, Kentucky, and the vast, often ignored interior parts of the country that resolutely refused to send politicians like her to Washington. She had executed this rhetorical strike with a broad smile, utterly convinced that her message had landed exactly as she intended. It had indeed landed with incredible force, just not in the location or with the effect she had anticipated. J.D. Vance did not visibly react to the barrage of insults. His facial expression remained completely neutral. Throughout his life and military career, he had been insulted by much better adversaries in significantly worse and more dangerous places. He possessed the profound, unshakable stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that the person doing the most talking in a room is very rarely the person who is actually winning the engagement. He patiently let her finish her entire thought. He sat quietly as the thunderous applause she had so clearly expected failed to fully materialize. Instead of a roar, a smattering of clapping padded out weakly along one deeply partisan side of the hall, quickly dying out before it could even reach the opposite side of the room. He let the awkward, lingering silence after her opening statement stretch a full half-second past the point of comfortable social interaction. And then deliberately, he let another half-second pass beyond that. The tension grew so palpable that the professional moderator visibly shifted in her chair, and a few attendees in the front row began to exchange confused glances, genuinely wondering if the senator had even heard the congresswoman's blistering attack. Only then did he lean slightly toward his microphone. The very first thing he did, defying all political expectations of an immediate counterattack, was offer gratitude. "Thank you for that, Congresswoman," Vance said, his voice steady and devoid of malice. "I sincerely mean it. That was just about the most honest thing I expect we'll hear all night long." He let the specific word honest sit in the air for a moment, letting the audience turn it over in their minds. And I want to take you up on your premise. You firmly stated that I am clueless about the world. That is a completely fair critique to put on the table. So let's leave it right there on the table. Let's find out which one of us truly cannot read a basic map. "I'd be more than happy to educate you," she responded slowly, her voice dripping with a mix of condescension and caution. "I would appreciate that, ma'am. I surely would." "I'm just a slow learner hailing from a slow place," Vance replied smoothly. He did not reach beneath the table for anything dramatic. There was no thick, weaponized folder of opposition research, no banker's box full of documents, no theatrical stack of props. There was merely a single, unassuming white index card resting face down on the fabric of his suit knee, a detail that practically nobody in the room had even noticed. He did not move to touch it yet. That was the specific dangerous trait about Vance that seasoned political observers who had watched him dismantle witnesses in Senate hearing rooms knew to actively look for. He never took his swing while his opponent was braced for impact. He asked the smallest, seemingly most innocuous question first, employing the cautious strategy of a man checking the depth and temperature of a dark body of water with one foot before trusting it with his full weight. Before we get to the big stuff, he began conversationally. "Let me ask you something little. You travel quite a bit now. High-level conferences, global summits, the elite international circuit. That's a good thing. A person should absolutely see the world before they attempt to explain how it works to the rest of us." He paused, letting the cadence settle. "When you were in Munich this past February, sitting on that massive stage with the international cameras going, do you remember that specific panel?" "I vividly remember it being weaponized by bad faith people like you," she retorted sharply, instantly defensive. "Go on," he prompted gently. "I will. I'm just trying to establish the ground level facts first so nobody can claim later on that you got tricked into a conversational corner. You went to Munich functioning as a leader. You stood up there next to powerful governors and foreign ambassadors. You wanted to be taken seriously on the world stage, and honestly, that's completely fair. That is a fine thing to want." He nodded slightly, an almost admiring gesture that resembled the way a man might compliment a neighbor's beautiful garden right before informing him that his expensive new fence was built 3 feet on the wrong side of the property line. "So we agree," Vance continued, summarizing the premise. "You were there acting as a serious person, speaking seriously about highly serious global things. You weren't overly tired. You weren't tricked by the moderators. You were ready." That is your own specific word pulled directly from your own live stream the morning after. "Ready?" "I was ready," she affirmed strongly, because her pride could not resist answering a question that inherently flattered her competence. "More than ready. I have never once walked into a room that I wasn't completely ready for." "Good. Hold that thought, Congresswoman. Hold it very tight." And with those words, the invisible trap finally closed its first inch without making a single sound. "I just wanted established on the official record," Vance explained, "so nobody can tell you later that you got cornered when you were tired or cornered cold. You walked in ready. You said so yourself just now in front of everybody in this room because somebody asked you a real simple geography question that night. It was not a trick. It was the exact kind of thing they put on a 5th grade social studies map quiz." He tilted his head, his expression almost uncomfortably kind. "You stood up in front of the entire watching world, and you confidently put the country of Venezuela below the equator. You placed it south of it, And the immense trouble is, ma'am, Venezuela sits entirely in the northern half of the world. Caracas is situated well north of the line. It's not a close call geographically. It is a miscalculation of a couple thousand miles, not a close call. The first spontaneous laugh erupted then, and it came fast. It happened because nearly everyone sitting in that packed hall possessed a fundamental map of the globe filed away somewhere in the back of their skull, and they all instinctively knew which hemisphere Venezuela was located in. They knew it without having to actively think about it in the exact same automatic way. You know the name of your own street. The laughter rolled up quickly from the middle section of the room. A man seated near the aisle frantically covered his mouth in an attempt to stifle his amusement, but he failed completely. The absolute cruelest part of the entire exchange, the part that made the revelation land with such devastating, bone-rattling force, was how undeniably small and basic the factual error was. She had not been caught in some deep, convoluted policy ambush regarding obscure trade tariffs or complex nuclear treaties. She had been caught on a map. It was the kind of brightly colored educational map that hangs proudly in every elementary classroom in every small town in America. She, the politician who had just moments ago called the veteran across from her too fundamentally dumb to understand the complexities of the world, had placed a massive sovereign country in the completely wrong half of the planet while on a prominent world stage with the cameras rolling. And then she possessed the breathtaking audacity to call the Marine sitting across from her clueless about the world. Her jaw set instantly, muscles twitching under the skin. She was a seasoned fighter. She had been ambushed before in political rooms significantly worse and more hostile than this one. So she instinctively executed the maneuver she always relied upon when the rhetorical ground began to crumble beneath her feet, which was to aggressively and entirely change what the actual fight was about. She pulled the microphone an inch closer to her mouth, and her voice quickly rediscovered its old familiar strength. Righteous anger was a psychological country where she had always felt completely safe and in control. "Let me tell you what is actually happening here in this room," she declared. She was no longer looking at Vance. She was staring past him, gazing directly out at the red lights of the network cameras, utilizing the strategy she always employed when she knew the resulting viral clip mattered vastly more than the immediate reaction of the room. A working-class woman of color, the proud daughter of immigrants, stands on a stage and is immediately put on public trial for a single minor slip of the tongue by a privileged man who has spent his entire adult life having things handed to him, she proclaimed passionately. Yale University handed him an elite degree. A massive publisher handed him a lucrative book deal. A tech billionaire handed him millions to buy a Senate seat and then maneuvered him into the second highest office in the land. And now he sits here smugly and performs this petty little quiz show, this transparent gotcha journalism tactic, simply because he cannot stand the sight of a woman who looks like me speaking with absolute authority about anything at all. She was building momentum, tapping into a well-worn narrative groove. Every powerful, outspoken woman in this country knows exactly how this game is played. You wait patiently in the weeds for her to make one human mistake, just one, and then you mercilessly use it to erase everything else she has ever accomplished. Because her mistake is permitted to define her in a brutal way that it would never, ever be permitted to define a male politician. This isn't about Venezuela. This has never once been about the geography of Venezuela. This is fundamentally about who is allowed to be perceived as smart in America. And wealthy men exactly like him have spent 400 years deciding it isn't women like me. For a fleeting, powerful moment, one had to give her credit. The defense was emotionally real, and the room physically moved with her cadence. It was a clean, well-practiced rhetorical punch. It had successfully landed 100 times before in 100 different debate rooms, and the deep muscle memory was still profoundly present in her delivery. A political reporter's pen started scratching frantically across a notepad. A young woman sitting in the third row who had been giggling uncontrollably just a second ago now looked down at her own hand, suddenly looking flush with guilt. The electrical current of the room was hers again, fully hers, and it held firm. You could physically feel the old, ingrained reflex move through the hall like a sudden change in the weather, the socially trained instinct of an audience to step back from the sheer size and weight of an accusation regarding race and gender, rather than intellectually answering the factual thing underneath it. That protective spell held for exactly about 20 seconds, and it might very well have held much longer, completely derailing Vance's strategy, but it was not Vance who ultimately broke it. Down at the far right end of the stage, another panelist leaned slowly into his own microphone. He was an older man, a lifelong dedicated Democrat who had sat silently through the entire tense exchange with his thick, weathered hands folded and his head angled downward. When he finally chose to speak, his words came out in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had been waiting a very long time to say one highly specific thing to his own party. "I'm going to say something, and then I'll go back to being quiet," the man stated firmly. "I am a Democrat. I have voted straight ticket with my party more years than not. And I grew up in a gritty steel town just outside of Youngstown. My dad broke his back on the manufacturing line. My mom spent her nights cleaning corporate offices to make rent. And I will not sit on this public stage and let you do that." He turned his body to look at the Congresswoman directly, his eyes filled with a lifetime of blue-collar frustration. "You keep saying working class. You keep saying it over and over like it's a password to win an argument. The working people I actually come from, the ones who physically turn the heavy wrenches and pour the concrete, you have never once bothered to ask them what they actually need. You merely speak for them at high-dollar, catered fundraisers in elegant rooms they could never even afford to stand in. So do not reach for that specific word to climb out of an embarrassing factual hole you dug yourself. Some of us actually are that word. We don't get the luxury of putting it on and taking it off whenever the cameras start rolling." Instantly, the trained, socially conditioned flinch left the auditorium. And what rapidly rushed back in to replace it was so much worse for the Congresswoman's political standing. It was permission. The young woman in the third row, who had gone completely cold with guilt, picked her doubt right back up, and this time she did not look away from the stage. You could tangibly feel the shift move through the hall, transferring from person to person. It was the quiet, devastating collective realization that the political spell that had protected her from serious scrutiny for years was, in fact, just a spell. And it had finally been shattered out loud by exactly the kind of person it was never, ever supposed to work on. An older, union-supporting Democrat on her own side of the political aisle, telling her directly to her face that she does absolutely not speak for the working people she constantly keeps invoking, all while a conservative Republican just sits there calmly and lets the implosion happen. Vance deliberately let the resulting silence breathe. He was exceptionally good at weaponizing silence. He took a slow, methodical sip of water and set the heavy glass back down with a small, deliberate click. For 3 long, excruciating seconds, that tiny click was the only sound audible in the massive hall. He was in absolutely no hurry. That was the unnameable quality the network cameras kept catching about him, but could never quite articulate. The imposing demeanor of a man who has spent agonizing hours waiting in much worse, much more lethal rooms than this one, and who guarantees he is never the one who blinks first. "I'd let it go right there," Vance said softly. "I want you to hear me say that clearly. A person mixes up a map under hot television lights, that's nothing. I've done far worse. I once foolishly told a room full of wealthy donors I'd read every single word of a massive bill that hadn't even been sent to the printer yet." A ripple of friendly, empathetic laughter washed over his side of the room. "So, I am absolutely not here to try and end a political career over placing a country in the wrong hemisphere. I'm truly not. But you didn't just call me clueless over geography, ma'am. You called me clueless about the world, the whole entire thing. War, military power, the grim reality of what happens when the diplomatic talking finally stops. And I have been a little patient about that specific insult because I figured you'd eventually walk it back. He shook his head slowly, expressing mild disappointment. But you doubled down instead. So, let's talk about the world, the real one. He slowly turned the white index card over on his knee. He still did not lift it into the air. He just looked down at it. Same international conference, same night in Munich, he stated, his tone shifting into something far more serious. After the map incident, somebody asked you the question that actually matters. They explicitly asked whether the United States should commit military troops to defend Taiwan if China aggressively moves on it. It was a basic yes or no question that the whole world desperately wanted an American leader to answer clearly. He looked up from his lap, and I'm going to read what you said word for verbatim word. Not my partisan words, yours, because I don't want you telling me later that I unfairly paraphrased you. The entire room went quiet in that specific dreadful way rooms go quiet when everyone present wants to hear the incoming answer but is simultaneously a little afraid of how bad it might be. You said, quote, and here, Vance read the transcript slowly, flatly, mercilessly letting each recorded stumble fall exactly where she had initially dropped it. I think that this is this is, of course, a very long-standing policy of the United States. He set the card down gently on his knee. That is the answer the self-proclaimed future of this country gave to the single most dangerous geopolitical question on earth on the exact night the entire world was listening. 5 ums. Absolutely no position. You stalled helplessly for the better part of 20 seconds, and then you weakly concluded that you hoped we'd never have to find out. Nobody laughed at that revelation. That one bypassed the humor reflex and went down somewhere significantly deeper into the solemn part of a room that seriously decides the fate of things. She reached for the microphone again, moving fast now, and the fighting steel was back in her voice. But there was something undeniably frantic underneath it that had not been present 40 minutes ago. That is a grotesque, bad faith distortion of a serious, highly nuanced position on the sheer catastrophe of endless American war, she fired back. I was being careful. Careful is not the same thing as clueless. Some of us actually think deeply before we casually send other people's children to die overseas. You want a simplistic soundbite? I refuse to give you one. That is not a weakness, Senator. That is the only kind of moral strength that matters. We're past Senator and respect Congresswoman, Vance replied immediately. His voice was not outwardly unkind, but the easy, folksy warmth had completely gone out of it, and what was left underneath was utterly flat, level, and ice cold. Respect was 40 minutes ago. Respect was before you looked out at the people in this country who fix your car and frame your house and pour the concrete you walk on, and arrogantly told them that a pickup truck radio made them too dumb to understand the world. I have sat at those worn kitchen tables. I was raised at one. Those people understand the real world just fine. They understand it the incredibly hard way, which happens to be the only way that actually sticks. He let the rebuke land with full force. You want to talk about sending other people's children to die? All right, let's talk about it. Because that's the one specific subject in this entire building where I am absolutely not the clueless one. And here, for the very first time all night, the quiet man's voice took on a sharp edge with a blade hidden in it. I went to Iraq in 2005, he stated. I was a United States Marine. I'm not going to stand up here and wave my service record around for cheap political points, because the young men I think about tonight don't get to run for anything, and they sure as hell don't get to do live streams complaining about how a debate question was unfair. I'm not going to give you their sacred names. They are not theatrical props for a panel. He paused. The room was deathly still. But I will tell you this much, because you absolutely earned it when you called me clueless about the world. When an American leader stalls for 20 agonizing seconds on whether we defend a critical ally, that isn't diplomatic caution out there on the ground. That hesitation has a massive bloody weight, And inevitably, somebody significantly younger than you and me is the one to carry that weight. I have watched boys carry it. I have physically helped carry one of them. So when you sit there and tell me your 20 seconds of empty silence was the brave kind, the thoughtful kind, I am going to need you to understand exactly who is listening when you say that. Because some of us counted those terrible seconds in a vastly different room than the luxury one you were in. And one of us keeps continually confusing a comfortable conference about the world for the actual world itself. They are not the same room, ma'am. They were never the same room. He picked the index card back up from his lap. After Munich, the fierce criticism came down on you. And here is the part I want the folks watching at home to hear real clear. A vast lot of it came directly from your own side. Democratic strategists, your own party's seasoned foreign policy people. One of them said, and I wrote it down specifically so I get it right, that you showed a complete lack of chops on international issues. Your people said that, not me. He laid the card flat on the table between them, and so in response you went on a late night live stream to explain yourself to your followers, and here is exactly what you said. You said the problem wasn't your lack of understanding. You said the problem was that the rest of us had just gotten too used to a president who never thinks before he speaks. He looked up over the rim of the table, his steady eyes burning into hers. You got asked one single vital question about the globe. You completely couldn't answer it. And your official explanation was that the question was somehow our fault for daring to expect an answer. The tension in the room finally broke. It was not a polite titter this time. It was a real, rolling, completely helpless laugh. It was the kind of deep, visceral laughter that forcefully takes a crowd over and will absolutely not give it back. The kind of laughter that violently builds on itself, where people start laughing partly at the absurdity of the thing itself and partly at the shared experience of each other laughing. The disabled veteran in the front row with a hitch in his leg shook his head with a massive grin he could not have stopped at gunpoint. A professional reporter 2 rows back laughed out loud, caught himself doing it on camera, bit down hard on his lip, and his shoulders just kept shaking anyway. She got asked the hardest geopolitical question in the world, froze completely for 20 seconds, and then literally said, "It was our fault for asking." She opened her mouth, desperate to answer, but Vance smoothly lifted one hand, not in a sharp, aggressive manner, but just enough to politely ask the moderator for the floor for a moment longer. And while we're being honest about the world, he pressed on, let's be truly honest about the part of it you actually live in. Because you do this deeply cynical thing, ma'am, where you put on the struggles of the working class like a fashionable coat when the cameras come on, and you take it off the second they go dark. This past spring, you stood up at a political rally and you explicitly told the North, to your exact word, pull up on the South, roll up on the red states. Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, like it was 1,860 all over again, and you were personally calling the cavalry to charge. He let the violent imagery breathe, and you said all of it from safely behind a thick sheet of bulletproof glass. You told the rural heartland to come physically fight injustice while you stood there, completely protected from the very people you were blindly summoning. Folks back home notice that hypocrisy, Congresswoman. They notice everything. They have to. They can't afford the luxury of the glass. A low guttural sound went through the hall, harder and more judging than a laugh. It is the specific sound a room makes when it collectively recognizes something uncomfortably true about a person's character. And that exact same season, he went on, his voice never once climbing in volume, the financial reporting comes out that you spent better than $50,000 of your campaign money staying in luxury 5-star hotels. $50,000. And that money came from the small dollar donors, the $10 and $20 working people who genuinely believed the coat you wear was real. He shook his head, looking slow and almost sorrowful. I'm not the one who lost the plot on the working class, ma'am. I just never arrogantly claimed to be its only voice in the room. You did. And then you stayed at the incredibly nice hotel on their dime and told them to go fight in the street. She had put a major country in the wrong hemisphere, told the Heartland to charge into battle from behind the safety of bulletproof glass, spent the hard-earned rent money of her own working-class donors on luxury hotels, and she had still confidently walked onto that stage and called the combat Marine the clueless one. She took the verbal beating. Give her credit to the bitter end. She did not go quietly into the political night. She straightened her spine in her chair, grabbed the microphone stand, pulled it aggressively close, and came back at him with absolutely everything she had left in her arsenal. And it was not nothing. You want to talk about where we came from? She hissed, her voice dropping low, fast, and furious. For the first time all evening, she sounded genuinely, profoundly moving. Let's do it. I came to this political work from behind a bar. I was making cocktails and clearing dirty tables, standing on my aching feet for 10 hours at a stretch, while men exactly like you were being groomed and mentored at Yale by the exact elite people who built the broken world you now try to lecture me about. You did not climb out of anything, Senator. You were pulled out by a wealthy hand that selectively reaches down for boys who can write the right kind of sad story about their own people and then conveniently leave them behind. She was leaning heavily over the table now, and the intense heat radiating from her was real. I learned this country from the absolute floor of it, not from writing a memoir about the floor of it, not from signing a multi-million-dollar Netflix deal about the floor of it, from the actual floor. I have passed legislation that puts real money directly in the pockets of working families in my district, while you were standing on a stage performing a fake nostalgia for a town you couldn't wait to escape. I represent the most diverse, complex district in this entire country, and they chose me again and again and again with their own hands, voting against everything wealthy people like you spent to defeat me. So do not sit there in your borrowed gravity, in your bought and paid for Senate seat, and tell me I do not know the world. I have had to intimately know it just to survive it. You got to study it from a safe, comfortable distance and call the studying wisdom. There is a massive difference between surviving a thing and merely auditing it. And that difference, Senator, is the whole story of you. You read about my life in a sterile focus group report. I have been violently living it since before you even knew it existed. Do not ever call that clueless again. And it was undeniably good. It was, for a fleeting moment, genuinely powerful rhetoric. Some of the political heat came back into the hall on her side. A journalist's pen or two stopped moving as they absorbed the blow. The electrical current wavered. She had reached at the very bitter end for the one true, authentic thing she still possessed, and it carried significant weight. Vance let her finish the entire monologue. He let the whole emotional weight of it land in the room. And then he did the one specific thing that took the gloves off for real. The moment where all the remaining patience went out of him, and it absolutely did not come back. Nobody up here is reducing the value of your life, Congresswoman, he said incredibly quietly. The entire room leaned forward in their chairs to catch the words because he had gone so incredibly soft. That you came up from behind a bar and you built something undeniably real, and I'd gladly shake your hand in respect for it in any parking lot in America, but that's not what's on trial tonight. What's on trial is real simple. He reached over and set the single index card down on the small table between them, placing it face up so the zooming television cameras could easily find the text. You stood on the massive world stage and you couldn't tell the public which half of the planet a sovereign country was in. You couldn't answer the one single pressing question every leader on earth has to be able to answer. And when your own political party pointed that out, you threw a tantrum and said the world was wrong for asking. He held his position there and his voice never once rose in pitch. You didn't just run out of an answer that night in Munich, ma'am. You ran out of the basic humility to admit you never had one. That arrogance is the only thing that's clueless on this stage, and it isn't the Marine. 11 words at the very end of it, maybe 10, and they accomplished what 10,000 screaming words would not have. They did not explicitly insult her. That was the profound thing the room would endlessly dissect and talk about later. That was the thing that made the moment land so much harder than any crass insult ever could have. He had not called her stupid. He had not called her a fraud. He had simply methodically set her own disastrous night down on the table right beside her own arrogant words, and let the two of them sit there together under the lights. And there was no political clarification or spin in the world that could ever pry them back apart. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked down at the plastic pen clenched in her hand. Her thumb had been drained white around it for a full, agonizing minute, and every high-definition camera in the hall had found it by now. It was the small, violent physical pressure of a person desperately holding on to the one last thing left to hold. She was a woman who had successfully talked her way out of every single room she had ever been cornered in. She had built a massively successful life on the unwavering certainty that the very next sentence her brain produced would save her exactly the way the last one always had. And for the very first time, in front of the entire watching country, the next sentence simply did not come. As the uncomfortable laughter she could not stop washed up toward the stage, the crushing internal pressure finally won. Her hand was no longer steady. The pen turned slightly in her paralyzed grip, slipped the last quarter-inch past her sweating fingertips, and fell. It struck the polished hardwood of the stage and bounced once. A small, bright plastic knock that the sensitive floor microphones immediately caught and carried out across the dead silent hall, sounding exactly like something dropped in an empty church. She did not reach down for it. She just looked at it lying there helplessly on the stage, this ordinary, everyday pen that had just profoundly betrayed her in front of the entire country. And then defeated, she folded her hands in her lap. The specific way you fold your hands when there is absolutely nothing left in them to hold, and she said nothing at all. The moderator, after a terribly long moment, asked gently whether the Congresswoman wished to respond to the senator's claims. She did not wish to respond. That specific sound, the plastic pen against the hardwood in a room so tense, you could have heard a pin drop that is the exact, undeniable sound of a political reputation permanently changing its shape on live television. By the time the security forum finally let out, the video clip already had a famous name. The name was simply 20 seconds. Somebody online had cut it perfectly clean, the geography map, the 5 stutterdoms, the angry Democrat from the steel town, and the pen falling on the floor. By midnight, you could not scroll for 10 seconds on any screen or social platform in America without it immediately surfacing again. Here was the part of the phenomenon that should have frightened her political team the most. People were not even arguing about it. They were not fiercely fighting in the comments about the defense of Taiwan or the legacy of Iraq or war powers or any of the enormous complex things she had desperately wanted the night to be about. There was absolutely nothing left to argue. They were simply watching a politician arrogantly call a Marine clueless about the world and then completely fail to answer a 5th grade question about it on a continuous loop forever, and laughing. The late-night broadcasts led with the frozen still frame of the pen mid-bounce, captured an inch off the hardwood, under a chyron that was nothing but Vance's devastating last line typed out in plain white letters. In the marble corridor just outside the auditorium, a reporter managed to catch a Democratic congressman who had publicly endorsed her campaigns more than once. The man did not want his name used on the record, and he nervously glanced both ways down the long marble hallway before he whispered it. Everybody saw this coming. We saw it in Munich first, and we naively told ourselves it was just nerves. It wasn't nerves. You can politically survive being wrong. You absolutely cannot survive being wrong and then telling the country it's their own fault for noticing. And he was gone down the corridor before the audio recorder even came fully up. The man with a hitch in his leg drove the long, quiet way back to Ohio that night. He did not bother turning the radio on. He just drove in silence, watching the dark interstate unspooling steadily in his bright headlights. And somewhere well past the state line, with nobody around to see him do it, he started laughing all alone in the cab of his truck, laughing at the profound memory of a plastic pen bouncing on a stage and a Marine who had actually been to the violent, complex world she only ever flew over in luxury jets. He kept driving home to a rural place some of the elite people on that stage truly thought was only a memory. And J.D., Vance, simply did the thing that Marines are trained to do, which is to accomplish the objective and leave without waiting around to be thanked. He slid the white index card quietly back into his jacket pocket, shook 2 hands with the event staff, and walked out past the frantic cameras calling his name walking right past the empty chair where the woman who lived by the microphone had finally, comprehensively run clean out of things to say. He had come onto the stage with exactly one card in his pocket. He left the stage with it still there.